Hey guys, Churchy here. So I was given access to New World as part of their content creators program, and over the past week between server queues, connection errors, crashes and maintenance, I've managed to sink about 25 hours into the game. I'll go into a little bit more detail in a moment, but first here's a TLDR version of my opinion. I would say that New World is a game with gorgeous visuals and audio that does a good job immersing you in its fantasy colonial setting. It has a very clean UI, reasonably satisfying action combat, especially for an MMO, and the crafting and gathering is competent enough, with crafting adding a nice bit of stat variation between item tiers, and the fact that they have Aussie servers is also a big positive for me, but unfortunately that's where my praises for New World end. The game has a lot of poorly implemented and lacking systems that create a lot of unnecessary frustration, and it feels like the reworks from a sandbox PvP focused game to a more PvE orientated game has generated a strange hybrid of the two genres that fails to shine in either area. It feels average at best, and in my opinion, in its current state is not worth the price tag of $56.95 AUD. Now let's go into a bit more detail. I really enjoyed the setting of New World. I love the look of the environments, towns, armors and weapons, and the Colonial era fantasy hybrid is definitely a concept I can get behind, and in that regard, New World is basically an MMO version of Greedfall. As I mentioned, the visuals, lighting and audio are beautiful, and at times create some really immersive and satisfying moments. I had a lot of fun turning my HUD off and roaming around as a solo player, collecting materials and doing a bit of hunting. At times I found myself happily getting lost in the world around me. The user interface also does a great job of keeping you immersed in the game. It's sharp, clean and informative, and fits very smoothly with the game's setting and visual themes, while also providing clear and concise information. The crafting systems in the game were competent enough and created some interesting item variation, even at low levels, which combined well with the trading post to allow for acquiring some interesting gear early in the game. One frustration here was that crafting tables would often be split across two parts of a town. For ease of play, all crafting stations should have been located next to each other at one crafting hub. The combat was my favourite part of the New World beta, and I think the game does a decent job of creating exciting action combat in an MMO. It was a satisfying process unlocking the different weapon masteries and developing my skills with the weapon attack patterns, enemy attack patterns, and my overall combat timings and skill rotations. Dodging and blocking added some extra depth, and I think overall the action combat is a solid foundation to build from, but it wasn't without its issues. The biggest issue I had, which is a subtle thing but started to make the combat feel clunky and unwieldy at times, was related to the animations. I think there should be some commitment to attacks and dodges, but a lot of the combat in New World, from skills to dodging and even weapon swapping, is very animation heavy, and it often feels like the tail end of each animation is about a quarter of a second too long, and you're locked into animations until they finish, which sometimes leads to a noticeable difference in where you're aiming your mouse or where you want to aim an attack, and where your character model actually commits to an attack. It also made dodging and weapon swapping feel a bit unresponsive or sluggish at times, and I think it's something that might need a bit of tweaking. In my opinion, combat also needs a little bit more variety and maybe some extra weapon skills. You can only have 2 weapons with 3 skills each, so a total rotation of 6 skills, which after a while gets very repetitive, especially when paired with the generally lacking variety of enemies you face. I was hoping for some more enemy variety, but because most of the southern regions are starter areas, I ended up fighting lots of undead pirates, undead temple guardians and ghosts, with some wildlife thrown into the mix and the occasional bat monster. My last hope in this regard was the Amrine Excavation Expedition. Expeditions are the game's dungeons. Unfortunately, this was pretty lacking too, and just involved moving from A to B, fighting buffed up versions of the same enemies I'd been fighting in the open world, and then fighting an even more buffed up boss. The only difference here being better loot rewards and the fact that we needed a healer and a tank in the party, and it was generally best to just mob the hell out of the enemies and use our skills wildly while relying on the healer to keep us alive. After experiencing this expedition, I also have some concerns about how much complexity and depth the combat will have in the endgame. Will there be interesting skill combinations between players? Will there be expedition bosses with interesting extra mechanics? Or will it just be a matter of spamming abilities in a mob? During my time with New World, I experienced a lot of frustrations, and the more I played, the more I started to notice the strange and often poor ways some systems in the game are implemented, and the more repetitive, lacking and grindy the content started to feel. One of the biggest issues in New World is the ridiculous distances you have to walk to reach objectives and locations. This walking issue also underpins and compounds a lot of the other issues that I have with the game. You can fast travel from shrines and outposts using the Azoth resource, but those outposts and shrines seem to be few and far between, and some aren't even marked on the map, and others are only marked after you've discovered them. I feel like the large travel distances are a holdover from a more PvP-oriented New World and were probably originally implemented with the shrine and outpost travel concept to create a feeling of tension in the open world as you try to make it home with your loot and resources. But because the open world is now primarily PvE focused, there is no tension, and for most players the walking is just wasted time. In my opinion, PvE players should be able to fast travel from anywhere, and some kind of speed buff or mount system or both will be required if the huge travel distances are going to remain in the game. At one point during the beta, I started a fresh character on a new server so me and some mates could team up and have a session together. It was a ridiculous process and it took us 2.5 hours to finally reach a point where we were all in the same location and able to try some PvP faction quests together. 3 of us spawned in one town, 2 of us in another, and then we had to do quest chains at the town we spawned in. I wasted time hiking up to the other town, expecting that I might be able to just start the quests in that town, and then had to waste my in-teleport to go back to the town I originally spawned at. Eventually, other town quest chains did open up, but not after a fair amount of mucking around in the town I spawned at. The ridiculous walking distances and minimal fast travel capabilities made the whole process of getting started and teaming up a messy and frustrating experience, and even when we did finally get a chance to team up, we'd already wasted most of the time we had to play together, and the faction PvP quests were pretty bad anyway. To help paint the picture of how bad, first I'll explain questing in New World. The quests in New World are extremely standard MMO fare, with quests like go to a location and kill 5 of the enemies there, or loot 5 of the chests. One exception to that is the resource gathering quests for the towns, where you can gather resources and then turn them in at the town for experience and standing rewards. An oddity with these town quests though is that you might want to use the materials you gather for crafting rather than turning them in at the town. I feel like the crafting system could have been made to mesh with the town quests rather than competing with them for a player's resources. Another quick note on quests is that some quests want you to hunt 3 animals and get 3 pieces of loot from that animal. Eventually I hit a point where I would usually instantly abandon those quests because the spawn rates for the animals were so low and there were too many players competing for them. While it was fun roaming around in a group of 5, the faction PvP quests we tried were just the same standard MMO fare kill and collect quests, but with higher level PvE mobs and with enemy players nearby. The whole thing was lackluster because it was usually a case of either getting zerged or being part of the group zerging other players. In this case, our party of 5 had the upper hand, and even that was boring because players could easily outrun us and run off a nearby cliff to get away because fall damage is minimal and we couldn't chase far because we wanted to stay in the area for our PvP quest, which was actually about killing PvE mobs. The most offensive thing that happened during our PvP session was when a couple of us died and failed our faction PvP quests. We'd already hiked about 1.2 kilometers to get to where we were, and the game expected us to hike back to town, pick up the quests again, and hike back if we wanted to try again. Failing your PvP quests on death seems like an extremely silly mechanic to me, and also a very unfair one. I can already imagine instances of people playing as a tank or a support and getting targeted more or sacrificing themselves for the good of the group, only to lose all quest progress and get no rewards, while the rest of the party is still fully rewarded. Fighting and dying is a core part of PvP combat, and it should not be punished so harshly, especially in this open world context when a huge travel distance is required to even take on the quests. I think the faction PvP quests should actually be PvP focused. You could have quest objectives like capture a camp and hold it for 10 minutes, or kill 5 enemy players. Objectives like that already sound much more interesting to me than kill 5 wolves that happen to be near enemy players. After finishing up the PvP quests for those who would still get the reward, we decided we'd try some PvE quests together and quickly found that the PvE faction quests are all randomized on a player basis. This meant that to go to each of our faction PvE quests would have involved travelling multiple kilometres in different directions. I think that PvE faction quests received while in a party should all be shared quests so that players can always move as a group and be working towards the same objectives. The only quests we found that lined up without randomization were the PvP faction quests, main quests, and side quests. The short amount of time we did have playing together was fun, but throughout the entire experience of trying to play as a group, we wasted so much time and there were so many frustrations along the way, and then so much more time wasted on top of that just hiking to objectives or abandoning objectives because it wasn't worth travelling the distance. Trying to play with friends was ultimately an extremely inefficient and problematic way to play the game, and in my opinion, that is a huge issue with New World. I think that as a new player, you should be able to instantly link up with your friends, spawn in the same area, and begin questing together immediately. Your quests should all be shared amongst the party so that you can all work together towards achieving the same goals, rather than the majority of quests being randomly assigned to players and then causing huge gulfs between what each player in a party is actually trying to do. I haven't played the 20-player versus 20-player PvPvE Outpost Rush mode or the 50-player PvE Invasions mode, and I tried to take part in the company-focused 50-player versus 50-player war mode, but there were already too many volunteers, so there was no way I was going to get selected for the event, and when I did try to log on to see if by some miracle I got in, I had a connection error. I don't want to speak too harshly about these game modes because I didn't get the chance to play them, but what I will say is that it's very worrying that I only saw 2 war modes appear and 2 invasions appear during one of my play sessions, and the start times for each were hours apart. Another time when I logged in, there was only 1 invasion available, and that wasn't starting until 2:30 PM the next day. I didn't see any outpost rushes available, and I have no idea how that was meant to be accessed. Outpost rush, invasions, and wars look to be some of the most interesting PvE and PvP content available in the game, so it's concerning that so few instances of these events were available. It's also not a good sign that 10 players for the PvE invasions are chosen by the town governors and then the other 40 players are selected at random. Even more concerning is the PvP war modes. It seems that to trigger a war in a territory, you have to grind out the crappy faction PvP quests I mentioned earlier, and then one of the companies, which are the guilds in New World, that have contributed at least 10% of the influence required to throw a territory into conflict, will be chosen via a lottery system to be the vanguard for the war event. The vanguard gets to choose the 50 players who participate in the event from their company, and if they don't have enough company members, they can then select other players to fill any remaining event slots. I feel that this implementation of the events will gate out smaller player groups from having any real chance of regularly participating in what seems to be some of the most interesting parts of New World, and when you combine that with just how infrequent these events are and the large number of players on the servers, it just makes the whole thing sound really unappealing. Again, I don't want to be too harsh given that I haven't played these game modes, but just based on what I've been reading and what I saw in game, I really don't like how these events seem to have been implemented, and I think they'll need to be far more frequent and less gated to keep players interested and to allow all players on a server a chance to participate. And that concludes my thoughts and experiences with the New World closed beta. On the positive side, it has a gorgeous game world with great environments, visuals, lighting, and sound that immerse you in a fantasy colonial setting, a clean and informative UI, a combat system that needs some more skills and enemy variety, and some more interesting expedition mechanics, but has a very solid action combat foundation, especially for an MMO, decent enough crafting and gathering, and a good spread of servers around the globe. Unfortunately though, the negatives outweigh the positives for me, and the frustrations I felt during my time with the game, as well as my experiences of the poorly implemented systems, added up more and more the longer I played. The ridiculous travel times between objectives and the poor implementation of fast travel, the horrendous task of trying to link up with friends at the beginning of the game, the stock standard MMO questing that quickly becomes grindy, the extension of that type of questing into faction PvP quests, and the instant failure of faction PvP quests on death, the primarily player-based randomization of quests and the way that pulls members of your party in different directions, rather than having shared party quests to keep you and your team trying to achieve the same goal, and the infrequent and somewhat gated nature of the more interesting PvE and PvP events in the game. To call back to the start of this review, even with the positive, New World has a lot of poorly implemented and lacking systems that create a lot of unnecessary frustration, and it feels like the reworks from a sandbox PvP-focused game to a more PvE-oriented game has generated a strange hybrid of the two genres that fails to shine in either area. It feels average at best, and in my opinion, in its current state, is not worth the price tag of $56.95 AUD. That's it for this review. I'm going to hold off buying New World and continue watching it from a distance with the hope that they'll work on a lot of the issues I've talked about. I do think the game has some potential, but it does need some reworks and redesigns, and I think the planned September release is a little bit optimistic, a little bit ambitious, given the state of the game. Let me know your thoughts about New World down in the comments. Thank you to the legends supporting me on Patreon. I could not be doing this stuff without you guys, and I really appreciate the support. It means a lot. And thank you for watching. Have a good day or night, whichever it may be, and I'll see you in the next video.